Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
Good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you find yourself. On behalf of the expert group for AIDS studies, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, which we have entitled Supporting Local Actors for More Effective Humanitarian Assistance. My name is Johan Schar. I am the former vice chair of the expert group, and as you just heard in the little introductory movie, the expert group is an autonomous independent committee under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden, which is tasked to review, analyze, and evaluate Swedish aid. And it selects its areas of investigation independently. And this time we are going to become acquainted with an evaluation that the expert group decided to do on Sweden's performance on localization. As I think we all know, after the Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in 2016 and the grand bargain that was agreed, localization is the commitment which has made the least progress of all the different commitments that were made. And we were interested to see how Sweden was performing on this specific, very important area. And it's clear that it's not only Sweden that is looking at this. My impression is that many donor countries are now again sort of revisiting the localization issue to find out what are the obstacles, why is progress so slow. So we commissioned an evaluation, and the team that has done that was led by Sophia Swithern. Today we will meet her. We'll also meet Charlotte Latimer and Gang Karume, who were team members. The evaluation included case studies in Myanmar, Ukraine, and DRC, where Gang finds himself. And so there are also team members from these other countries who will, I think, probably be listening today, but will not be appearing doing presentations. We have already done a launching seminar in Sweden on this evaluation, as it was directed primarily to a Swedish audience, to SIDA, the government aid agency, and to the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. But we found and concluded that the evaluation contains lots of interesting findings, conclusions, and recommendations that are relevant, we think, for a wider audience, not least as several donors countries are now sort of looking into the same issue. And therefore, we felt that it was well justified to do a presentation for a larger audience, and that's why we have invited you to this webinar today. If you are interested in the report, I think there was a link in the invitation, but if you have not found that yet, you can find and access the report at the website of the expert group, which is simply www.eba.se. eba.se. We are going to listen to a presentation that is going to be done by Gang Karume, who finds himself in Bukavu. After that, we will have comments from a panel, and I'll introduce the panelists when we get to that stage. But to begin with, I would like to invite Gang to do the presentation of the report, and this will take approximately 20 minutes. Please go ahead, Gang.
For this opportunity that you have offered me. You've offered me to talk about our evaluation, and I thank the entire team for all the work that we've done together. And the evaluation is titled the evaluation of Sweden's application of the Grand Bargain localization agenda. As Johan has said it was commissioned by EBA, and the team was of 5 people, counting, 6 people, counting Sophia, Charlotte, and Teddy, Dmitro, Katrina, and myself. Next slide, please. Where does this report come from? This report, as I said, comes from EBA, who is there to monitor CEDA, fund use, to get guide policies. And that's where the study comes from. It was that EBA order to the team, to our team, to conduct this study. That's where the report comes from. Next slide, please. We are going first to pass on the context in which this study was conducted. The context in which the study was conducted is, it comes from the Grand Bargain, the World Humanitarian Summit. And one out of the major recommendations of the World Humanitarian Summit was the Grand Bargain. And so many countries and donors committed to the Grand Bargain. And the commitment was throughout localization. And our study is actually trying to look at the case of localization and the commitments that come with it. Everybody is common that local and national actors are first responders when a crisis, a given crisis, be it human, be it natural, hits. Local and national actors are first responders. And the donors have all recognized that there have been limited progress since they committed to the Grand Bargain. And they've committed a quite important number of studies. Maybe I'll talk about that later on when I'll be speaking about the DRC case, the localization case studies. And CEDA was actually did not stay behind, and that's the reason why they committed, they recommended this study, they committed this study. And our research is starting from the Grand Bargain with 6 dimensions of localization that we studied throughout. And there is a kind of common understanding, like it came out of the global key informant interviews. We say the main barriers are systematic, and as long as we rely on goodwill for change to happen, it will be too slow and too little, because it doesn't sufficiently disrupt the way the system is biased. I think that's the reason why everybody is common that there's been less progress toward implementing the localization agenda and the Grand Bargain. Next slide, please. What did the evidence show? The evidence show, we actually, as I said before, worked on 6 different 6 dimensions. And for each dimensions, we really had many fundings, but we are going to present the three major fundings for each dimension. And should you like to have the details for all the fundings into details, at the end we'll be sharing the link to the full report, and that will inform you further on each all the findings under each dimension. Next slide, please. Yes, I talked about the 6 dimensions of localizations that we studied, namely strategy, funding, partnership, capacity, leadership, and knowledge. We were actually under each dimension trying to look at trying to take the principal humanitarian action and see what is actually being recommended, what is being actually said, and what is actually happening on the ground for each of the 6 dimensions. Next slide, please. The first dimension that we looked into is the strategy. As you could see, the saying from Southern Sudan, one of our key informants from Southern Sudan, the key informant said that they are not clear what they want on localization. There is no common position as a CEDA, different position from global people and country level. And actually, if you look at the 3 major findings there, it is clearly said, and it appeared from all people we interviewed, that CEDA prioritizes localization. That was clear. But it lacks a clear strategy or a policy that is specific to CEDA. And actually, all international organizations we're talking to, they said they all work with the Grand Bargain definition of localization, and that was it. And that also applies to CEDA that functions out of the Grand Bargain localization definitions, but they don't have their own strategy. And the second finding was, and then that's what we said, if there's no strategy, we all commit to the Grand Bargain strategy and definition, then it appeared that if CEDA did not take a strong stand, partners are still risk adverse, but CEDA had to take a strong stand so that the clarity CEDA would bring out would kind of showing other people that CEDA is really serious on it, and everybody would be keen at showing its good intention toward materialism localization. And finally, interviewers thought that CEDA is a quite donor on localization, while they have a strong feeling that CEDA is quite influent, very influent to advance the localization strategy. It has already one in place. Next slide, please. Yes, we talked about funding. We explored the funding, sorry. We explored also the funding dimension. And here again, the three fundings that we could get is only 17% of CEDA humanitarian allocation it gets to 17% of indirect funding has been released by CEDA. That is still low as compared to the 25% commitment. And out of that indirect funding, there is nothing that goes to local and national actors. And another problem is there are many barriers that prevent more direct funding to local and national actors. And out of the barriers, the major barriers, it was pointed out the low risk tolerance and the capacity to manage the admin burden. That was the finding that was brought out as far as barriers were concerned. And quality-wise, it was pointed out that the quality of funding for local national actors is perceived as equally is perceived as equally and more important than the quantity. If I could sum up, out of the three fundings, it is only 17% out of the 25 commitments has been so far released, and out of this 17%, there is nothing for local national actors. There are barriers toward funding to more direct funding to local national actors, and the barriers are linked to low risk tolerance and admin burden. And finally, talking about the quality funding, we are saying that equality is not there at the table. Next slide, please. Yes. When we are talking about with many informants at the global level, this is what was globally said. We appreciate the collaboration, but it's about how to get the operational side to align with the rules and regulations. How to get over the audit mindset, which makes it hard for CEDA to stand by their aspirations. And out of the many fundings that we got under the partnership dimension, we could set the quality of partnership with LNS is important. Everybody was common on that, but there was a different understanding of what quality partnership looks like. Secondly, on the fundings, they talked about a fair and equal access to partnership. That was really not fair, and it was uneven. People thought that international actors had a quite easy and advantageous connection and access to donors than local and national actors have access. And finally, co-ownership of risks, they said it's rare. And actually, they were just questioning, we cannot be partners and not take equal risk. I think this is part of partnership. Sharing risk equally would actually reinforce the partnership that currently exists. They are all common that it's there, but it's not there to the point where they want it to be. If I should sum up, we are talking of three major findings, that is quality of partnership with different understanding from different stakeholders. We are talking of fair and equal access to partnerships and mainly access to donors. And we are talking about equal risk sharing when we are into partnership. Next slide, please. Yes, the fourth dimension that we studied was about capacity strengthening. And I remember I was the one who got that message from one of the key informants who told me that no one can pretend to better know our needs than ourselves. And they're saying the ideal in this would be that those give opportunities to local national actors to identify their own needs and give them the means to address those needs. And that one, it's myself who got that from one of the DRC interviewees. And here again, many findings, but the three measures are the tension between Sweden's life-saving priorities and building capacity to deliver on it. And the second finding, most major finding, was most capacity strengthening focused on compliance with international requirements. And finally, the third major finding was scope for learning on capacity strengthening from CEDA development experience. let's go to the capacity building efforts. That was said top down. International actors, they come with what they think are the needs and the capacities, and they bring them down, but they never get time to ask from down, what are your needs, so that we can bring it up and train on that and deliver on that. Next slide, please. The fifth dimension that we explored was about leadership and participation. 90% of the work is done by local and national actors. And the UN agencies and international organizations are making the decisions in the main office without having to be in the field. That comes from one Myanmar key informant. And that has been materialized throughout the two fundings, major fundings we are presenting there, that Swedish funding has been used to indirectly support local and national actors to participate in international coordination. Flexible funding has allowed international partners to support national partners in this area. But there is limited evidence of Sweden using its leverage to involve local and national actors in global fora. There was very little to no evidence on that. And secondly, there are significant barriers to local leadership and participation. And practical barriers include, for example, the language, the staff time and budget. And out of the language, for example, the documents that are mostly written in English, the trainers that are more English speakers, and all that. And also, it has been said that not all international actors that are actually opened up to this change. And power sharing is still a problem to be shared. And that was also mentioned under the barriers to local leadership and participation. Next slide, please. The final dimension that we explored, studied, is knowledge. And actually, we have to recognize that it has not been discussed really, but the ambition from, and this is coming from the global level, the global interviewees. They say it haven't been discussed really, but the ambition is there to shift the research being done together with the local organizations, but there is no funding on from Sweden side. And the three major findings about this knowledge dimension are, there are some evidences that show that there is Sweden support to evidence on localization. And most research on localization are led by international actors, and that is true. Maybe for chance, I'm going to present the initiative, localization initiatives that have been going on in DRC, and it's actually true that most of them, all of them are actually led by international actors. And finally, the scope to learn from CEDA overall approach to local ownership and equality in research. That's what I would say under this knowledge dimension, and that was actually the sixth dimension that we explored under this study. Next. Yes, question. What does this mean for progressing localization agenda? You are talking about your perspectives here. Next slide, please. It has been identified that 4 normative shifts are required, are suggested. The study has pointed out the 4 normative shifts if we are to move forward the localization agenda. Myanmar said, one of our key informants in Myanmar said, local partners are the ones that go to difficult places. There has to be sufficient funds for risk management and risk reduction. This way, the local partners can mitigate the risks. As I said before, we are talking of partnership, but we are not really keen at taking equally risks. And that is being brought out by one key informant. And the 4 shifts that are looking, we are looking forward to are prioritizing localization, balancing flexibility with assertiveness, adapting risk management, and improving sustainability. Out of these 4 normative shifts, you could see, for example, under balancing flexibility of assertiveness, that using existing opportunities is to ensure flexible fund support to support localization. As I said again about adapting risk management, it is improving cooperation between operational and audit functions, and consider risk to as well as risk of local and national actors. It's not that the local and national actors should be the only one taking risks, but they have to consider that risk is a piece of partnership and it has to be equally shared. And finally, under improving sustainability, we are talking about incentivizing the multi-year support to local and national actors for the sustainability. Next slide, please. Yes, and 3 practical considerations that the study suggests is leveraging Sweden influence. People we talk to are all common that SIDA is among the major donors, and like in DRC context, the most influential donor, because it is a part of the humanitarian DRC Humanitarian Fund, the directory, the board. It's a major donor, and people think that there is more SIDA can do to influence via her voice and via its connection to various stakeholders. And the second practical consideration is to improve internal coordination. And it is really curious to see that the actors that are working toward localization, they are working in different directions, but there is a way to improve the coordination, and as we put it into bracket, like forging Team Sweden connections at all levels. And finally, investing for change. Scaling up pilots and investing in operating procedures and internal shifts would be would be also a practical consideration to keep in mind to move the localization agenda forward. Next slide, please. Yes. And unfortunately, I'm sorry, but they just repeated the same title of 3 practical considerations. But here, I would like to share, being from DRC and to have worked in many localization studies. I just wanted to share with you some of the efforts that are going on the ground here in DRC. Those are the 6 ones I could think of. Is Concern Worldwide has conducted a study to explore the 3 dimensions in a relationship with toward localization. And they explore the founding dimension to human resources management and the power in partnership. It was almost the same exercises where they talked to various key stakeholders and they collected their the information and put it together. And the draft report has already been released, but the final one is not out yet. Should one be interested to know more about that, I'm happy to continue the talks bilaterally. START network is the network of networks that conducted a pilot in 5 countries. That is India, Guatemala, Palestine, DRC, and the Fiji in Pacific. And they wanted each country to start a hub that would be a gathering of national actors so that they could raise higher their voices and be heard and be represented at different levels of their respective countries' humanitarian coordination. CONAFOD is the umbrella platform of 5 professional platforms to raise up their voice and influence, because originally the working are in a different solo silos, and their voices could not be heard. But when they organize themselves into this CONAFOD, now they have 5 representations within the DRC humanitarian country team, and at all the levels of representation they are there. Diakoni is a German initiative that pulled together international and national actors and giving national actors the opportunities to be the lead of the consortium where international actors were under the leadership. And there is a it's really inspiring, and there are very good lessons that can be drawn from that. And finally, USAID explored 2 initiatives with initiative innovation, innovation entrepreneuriat social. That's IES. It's a local Tetra Tech structure, and the one with the social, that is an international Tetra Tech. And USAID is funding directly 6 national actors and providing them technical support so that they can be able to manage important USAID funding. And the one with Socha was to explore the DRC local actors mapping and the market compensation survey. These are quite important numbers of studies that are ongoing, and to show that really localization, people understand that it's the way to go, but we think that our study think that we can still put it further. Next slide, please. Thank you very much to listen for your time to listen to me. You'll find the link there for the full report that gives more details about the dimension, about the context, about the findings, about the recommendations, and about the team and EBA. Everything in this full report. Please take time to explore it. It's really amazing. And I thank you very much. Should you have questions, I'm happy to respond to, and the team is also happy to respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gang. Great that you could give us a sense also of what's going on in DRC in terms of localization research and new initiatives. It gives us a sense of this has become, again, a very active and topical issue, which is being addressed in many different countries. We'll give an opportunity to Charlotte Latimer from the team also to give any additional comments that you would like to add, given that it's been a few days since we prepared the presentation and so on. And any additional comments, please, Charlotte.
Thanks very much, Johan, and thank you, Gang, for for presenting on behalf of the team. Just a few things to stress. I think Gang has already mentioned that there was a multi-country team working on the evaluations. We had colleagues also in Ukraine and in Myanmar, and Teddy, a team, part of the global team, who was based in Uganda. But also to say that we were drawing on experiences from a number of other countries. So we talked to people and drew on background documents from Afghanistan, from Somalia, from Palestine, from Bangladesh, South Sudan, etc. There was a long list of countries. The other thing I just wanted to stress is that we were working on the evaluation and the research during most of 2023, and a lot was changing as we were actually working on the evaluation, and a lot has changed since too. It continues to change. So what we were sort of trying to keep up with was what was going on particularly within CEDA at the time of the evaluation. So they were already taking some quite important steps. As Gang said, there was no clear policy on localization at the time that we did the evaluation, but they were working on some guidance at the time, which I believe is now out and public, and that's for guidance for their CEDA's international partners in terms of working on localization. And they were also working on piloting in a few select contexts where they were experiencing funding directly for national NGOs, and trying to learn from that experience. So that was happening as we were working in 2023. And there's also been some big changes, I think, policy changes going on within the Swedish government at the moment, affecting how it works with its international partners. And we sort of wait to see the impact of those changes, which haven't yet, I believe, affected humanitarian partners, but development partners only at this stage. So Gang already pointed out, many of our sort of conclusions. There were maybe a couple that I'd like just to highlight that seem perhaps more relevant than ever, because as well as things happening within the Swedish government, obviously there's been big sort of shifts and changes in the sort of external landscape as well. And some of the conclusions that we came to seem more relevant now, I think, than ever. And I think perhaps as we see, the incredible sort of increase in humanitarian needs and the stretch on resources, this tension that CEDA was facing around being flexible, as Gang said, as a good donor, a good humanitarian donor, and being flexible, but also really putting pressure and being assertive with its international partners in terms of the way that they partner with local organizations. And that's one of the things. There's no easy answers to that. We were really cognizant that that's a big challenge for them, but really important that they grapple with that and find a way to hold international organizations to account, both UN and NGOs, in terms of how they work with local partners. And then I think the point on risk management is really key. What we're seeing in, for example, in Gaza right now, in terms of the risks that local partners are taking in reaching people in need, and the importance of not just thinking about the risks of working with local partners, but really thinking about the risks that local organizations are taking on a day-to-day basis when they're working in contexts like Gaza, where at the time CEDA was actually doing some really good work in terms of forward thinking on localization and beginning to think about piloting direct support for local organizations. So I think I'll leave it there for now, Johan. I'll hand back to you and be on hand if there are any questions coming up in the discussion.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. Unfortunately, we cannot invite the participants to ask questions or comment on camera or using their microphone. So I ask you to use the Q&A function, which is being monitored by my colleague Mats Horsmar, who is the Deputy Director of EBA sitting in Stockholm. So please be active and use the Q&A function. I will now invite three panelists, very experienced and knowledgeable on this topic, to give their comments, around 5 minutes each. And let me introduce them. First of all, it's Anita Katakuzi. I probably mispronounced your surname. Apologies. You have to correct me. Who is the Director of Policy Network for Empowered Aid Response, also known as NEAR. And Anita is joining us from Athens. Then we'll ask Smruti Patel, who's the founder of Global Mentoring Initiative, to give her comments. She is joining us from Geneva. And then finally, Vijaya Lakshmi Viswanathan, who is an independent consultant joining us from Mumbai or Bombay, whatever you like to select as the name of that city. She has a background with ALNAP and in other functions where she's done extensive research on localization. She's given me permission to call her VG, so I'll do that as of now. But please, Anita, please begin.
Thank you, Johan. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Is it evening for some? Nice to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Yes, my name is Anita Khattakuri. It's a South Indian name. I am the policy director of NEAR, which is a network of nearly 300 civil society organizations across the global South, from 40 countries, actually, from 40 countries across the global South. I think that the evaluation of Sweden's application of the Grand Bargain, and the localization agenda, it's both timely and important. I really appreciated the research and the presentation here. Thank you. So let me give you some framing for NEAR localization. We define localization as an agenda that is a change process to transform aid systems. And we see that change is required at different levels: incremental change or making tweaks to the system, cultural change, and transformational or systemic change. And I think that, within the report, there's a good recognition of some of the strides that have been made, significant, to kind of nudge the system forward incrementally and improve it. But challenges definitely persist, and local and national civil society, local actors at large, they continue to be underfunded, marginalized within the system, despite their very critical role within humanitarian action, development action, peace building, you name it, aid action. And those discrepancies, I think, well, we see they highlight the need for more focused efforts. The report identifies the slow progress in Sweden's localization efforts, and I do agree that that is reflective of broader international trends, despite widespread commitments made under the Grand Bargain. Most international donors are facing very similar challenges in meeting the commitments that they've made, and the bureaucratic, legal, resource constraints. These are things that we hear and know all the time. I think that they are widespread, and they limit the direct channeling of support, whether in funds or other kinds of support to local actors. And I think that those limitations, those persistent barriers, actually have led to a continued reliance on international intermediaries that does need to change. A few points on the lessons learned. So I think that the necessity of developing and implementing clear strategies and policies for localization, grounded in clear definitions of local and national actors. This is something that the report suggests. I think Sweden's lack of a unified policy really highlights the need for coherent and consistent application across all levels, and that's something that we've seen across other donor governments. That is not unique to Sweden. I'd like to draw out the point flagged also by Gang and Charlotte on the assertiveness and flexibility. That, for sure, let us not be confused that assertiveness with strategic partners of Sweden does not actually doesn't need to change the flexibility of funding. The requirements of international strategic partners is something that to support equitable partnerships and sharing of resources to local and national actors doesn't actually change the nature and quality of flexibility. Long-term investments in capacity strengthening, that is something that was flagged within the report, and I want to flag that NEO members really want to see capacity strengthening efforts taking a systems approach, supporting how local actors work together, as well as being driven by the needs identified by themselves rather than imposed from the top down. I thought that the inclusion of knowledge as a dimension to be studied is so important, very, very critical. I hope we all take on board this dimension more seriously. Progress towards this reform agenda does need to be validated by local and national actors. There's a lot of actors within the system who say they are making good progress, but based on self-assessment, progress as self-reported does not necessarily equate to progress felt by local actors. I think in terms of the practical suggestions, really appreciated those within the research. I want to support the recommendation to expand pilot projects for direct funding to local actors and using that learning to scale up successful models. Building a bit from those 3 suggestions, I think setting explicit targets as part of the Sweden's strategy and policy for funding to local actors, regularly monitoring and tracking and monitoring that progress, that those are really important. Investing in locally led flexible funding mechanisms for local actors. I think that's an important strategy. And yeah, ensuring a transparent and robust partner selection process that I think can also go a long way in ensuring Sweden's commitment to localization is very clear across the board to all partners. As a final point,
yes, please.
As a final point, I do think that there's like a really good roadmap for improvement, not just for Sweden, for other donors. I think it's important that we all take much bolder steps than we already have to support local actors in their role at the forefront of response. Thanks.
Thank you, Anita. That's very good. That's great. And we take your point, speaking about SIDA, not least, that there should be no dichotomy between assertiveness and flexibility. Donors should be able to manage both, and we do need both. So let's move on to Smruti, please. Your 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the presentation. So my name is Smruti Patel, and I'm the founder of Global Mentoring Initiative. And actually have been working on the whole localization issue for, I feel like, decades. But I would say my path really started when I was part of the tsunami evaluation. And the theme was the impact of international response on local capacities. And this was in 2005 when we did the evaluation. And some of the findings and the things that has come up in this report so resonate still, right? So that was a long time ago. And in that time, I think I've seen a lot of change, but one thing I wanted to pick up on, and this is so key to making any progress, right? That issue around power and decision-making about resources and allocation at country level is absolutely key. We have seen in our research in 10 countries that the power dynamics from the global level to the country level are even worse, right? So there is a hierarchy. And in that hierarchy, donors are at the top making the decisions. And we see that actually communities who we are supposed to be supporting and for which we raise funds are in a way at the bottom of the ladder. And even though we've been talking about participation, revolution, localization, these things are not translated actually into practice, even though now we have the grand bargain commitments. I think one key thing is even some of the phrases we use. So, for example, making principled humanitarian action as local as possible and as international as necessary. Well, who decides? Right now, is the internationals decide what's possible and what's necessary, right? Unless we deal with that conundrum, we will not make progress. So I just wanted to bring that in. So those kind of phrases for me are problematic, right? And we need to look at how do we shift the decision making? And again, going back to the equitable partnership, right? How do we make sure that the partnerships that are formed are equitable? And also right now, what we've seen in our 10 countries study as well is actually local actors right now are kept on really shoestring budgets with low trust, and also which then afterwards leads to low capacity trap, right? So even when capacity is built, it's not linked to financial sustainability of the organization. So even the capacity they build, they lose to international actors, right? So I think there has to be really a more deeper reflection on how do you support and reinforce local actors so that they're able to carry on. And one thing I do want to bring in is different layers of different actors, right? So Anita, you said we need to define, right, who the local actors are. I want to bring in those local actors, actually, there are some who are very well funded, right? They keep repeating getting funded, and they are called the donor darlings, right? So it's not that not everybody's funded, right? There are some. So, for example, the women-led organizations, they are least funded from the others, right? So we also have to focus on what types of organizations we want to fund who will really access the population in crisis, who will really access the most vulnerable as well, right? So somehow we need to focus a bit about which actors that we should be funding and supporting. In my time, I have seen a lot of changes. So some people are saying, oh, we haven't seen much change. Actually, I've seen a lot of changes. A lot of changes because local actors are more vocal now. They are aware of the commitments. They are pressing for changes. Some organizations, some people within the administration feel or interpret localization commitment very differently to others. So it's really important that whatever policy and strategy that's set is understood right from the HQ to the country level. And then the right attitudes and behaviors are in place so that it actually happens. Because often the policies are there, but the people at the front end don't understand, or they interpret it in their own way, right? And that makes all the difference in terms of how then things are being executed. So I would really say that this is great. I'm really very happy to see CEDA take this on, but systematically, right? Not ad hoc approach, a strategy that is set and a path to implementing that, and then putting resources behind it. You know, we keep talking about capacity of local organizations. Well, actually, the capacity of donors is very lacking in this regard. You have to invest in your own staff and your, I would say, your structures to ensure that you reinforce the capacities for local actors. Other focus really on intermediaries, because we know that the amount of
conclude, please, Smruti.
Can you hear me?
Yes, could you conclude, please?
Yeah, I'm just saying that the amount of crises there are now, we need all of us. We need intermediaries, we need local actors, everybody needs to be on board. But what should be a real focus is about fair sharing of the resources and ensuring that those resources are placed where it's most impactful, and I think local actors are losing out on that. So there has to be really more focus on the ICR, making local organizations more sustainable, and please also think about women-led organizations and other organizations who have lacked the resources, because they are at the front end, they are at the sharp end. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. And thank you, not least, for reminding us that this ultimately is an issue of power. Who decides? Who controls this system? And I think it's very important that we remind ourselves that this is the case. And also pointing out that donors do not necessarily have the capacity or the insight to really explore and identify who are the best local partners. A lot of this is done by routine, which obviously is not good enough. So thank you. Now, Vijay, please.
Thanks, Johan. Good evening, everyone. And yeah, forgive me if I cover some of the points that Anita and Smriti have already covered as well, because similar to them, I did find that the findings from this report did reflect what I've also seen across the sector. Today, I'd like to reflect on 5 points in particular, and I come at these from both the perspective of a local and national practitioner, and also from having worked on this issue in a research capacity. The first is the question of localization simply as a tick box exercise. And this is a worry that resonates across the sector, including in a scoping study that I did last year for ALNAP. The phrase that really stuck with me was mini-me's. INGOs and other intermediary organizations talked about trying to find local partners that actually fit neatly into the international system in order to meet their targets. On the other side, there were national and local organizations who were remaking themselves, often giving up what makes them unique in order to become acceptable partners and access funding. This is an issue that I understand may be hard to account for in policy, but simpler compliance would be a start. Second, who is seen as the donor? And for me, the fact that this was brought up in the report was really interesting because it's an experience that we've also faced. For national and local organizations at the end of the funding line, the intermediary organizations are the donor. They're the ones who control your funding, and they're the ones who control the fate of your program. So even for those who are supportive, the power imbalance and the focus on upward accountability really makes this an unequal relationship. And when implementing projects, there were times that we didn't know who the back donor or original donor was, because we only found out because their logos were added to a banner or a report. In other words, it's still a rare and very privileged position for a local organization to be able to speak directly with a donor like SIDA or anyone else without the filter of an intermediary. And this is a really important consideration to keep in mind. Third, a thread in the report, which a lot of people have touched on, that concerned me was the perceived conflict between the well-established flexibility of Sweden's funding and its localization goals. Flexible and unearmarked funds have constantly been a key demand of quality funding, and not many donors have been doing this consistently. So keeping that balance is going to be really key. Fourth, whose risk and how much risk? For the staff of national and local organizations, the ability to survive, sometimes literally survive, is based on policies and risk calculations that aren't in their hands at all. And we really saw this during COVID in terms of health coverage, skewed risk exposure, and the disparate ability to access treatment. More recently, funding being pulled from UNRW in Palestine based on allegations, and then the downstream impacts of that also show us how politics influences humanitarian action. And so all of these are also considerations to keep in mind when we talk about sharing risk. What does it actually look like on the ground for the people at the front line? Fifth, and finally, I was a little disappointed to see that localization is still being thought of as, or framed at the top end as a means to deliver life-saving support and a means to an end. How do we move forward in ways that actually enable locally led action rather than a tinkering of the existing system from the top down, which is something that Anita and Shruti also touched on. So there's a whole world of locally led action and mutual aid, which is communities supporting each other, that already exists in the majority of crisis responses. Yet this world and the world funded by international humanitarian aid, which is still a minority, still have very little overlap. So in creating new localization policies, can we make it so that these two worlds align better? I would reiterate the recommendation on a more joined up Team Sweden approach, which looks at localization across both the humanitarian and development lens, and which includes supporting civil society. For local teams delivering on the ground or who are part of affected communities themselves, these distinctions really don't make sense. I mean, what does life-saving increasingly mean in protracted crises or recurrent cycles of disasters or places where civil society is completely shut down? As Sweden develops and furthers its localization policy, I would really encourage them to reflect on the impact of these policies on how it plays out on the ground. Because as we see with other donors, including FCDO and USAID, the policies in writing and the policies in practice are turning out to be very different things. And I hope the pilots directly funding local organizations will give some insight into these challenges of how people on the ground actually face them. I'll stop here and hand back to Johan. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Fiji, for giving us a really local perspective on the topic, reminding us that for local organizations, what they deal with are what we call intermediaries. They rarely see the donor, and I think we need to keep that in mind also when we look at what kinds of reforms and changes are needed, and also the fact that from a local perspective, you make no difference between what is called humanitarian and what is called development for a local community. These are sort of part of the same kind of context. So that's a very healthy perspective that we need to keep in mind. And it seems that the system is being tweaked, but we don't see, I think all three panelists do not see any sort of real major transformation yet, at least, happening. I'll invite Sophia now to give, just as the third member of the team that we are meeting today, just to give a few reflections on what you've heard, and then we'll invite the audience to ask questions and comment. Please, Sophia. Great. We are a little behind schedule, so please, if you can keep it relatively short.
Extraordinarily unfair, because I think everybody who's spoken so far has given us so much to chew over, and so much to respond to. But hopefully, we'll have a chance to do that in the Q&A. And just to say, Anita, Smruti, and Vijay, we really respected and drew on your work as we brought together this evaluation. So Anita and Smruti, the frameworks that you and your organizations have developed over the years were very much a starting point for our framework. And Vijay, you and I spoke as you were putting together the LNAP synthesis, and we were working on this evaluation, and it was extremely useful. And Vijay, I think your last point around the scope of our study, we were very conscious as we wrote it that we're talking particularly about how Sweden as a donor, and in particular Sweden's humanitarian units, together with the MFA, can use their aid better. But within this, it's so important to take a much bigger view of them being part of, let you say, one world, which is not colliding with this much wider world, and very much needs to. So I'm just going to make a few points that struck me as each of you spoke, I think that point around capacity strengthening and looking at capacity strengthening for Sweden and as a donor is really important, and that's something that very much came through for us. That the capacity was very strong in some places, that there were really well-informed, committed individuals leading the way in certain country offices, in headquarters, but there were also enormous missed opportunities for that capacity to be mainstreamed and to be learnt from across the organization. And that leans towards another point that came out strongly from what you were all saying there, which is around this necessity for coherent application that comes from that capacity strengthening and learning. And the fact that one of the things that came out for us was the mismatch between what was happening, for example, in the humanitarian unit and in the MFA, where the bulk of the core funding to UN agencies comes from. And what we found that when it comes to this flexibility versus assertiveness, there were actually quite a lot of points in the system that CEDA could use and was using to lean on its partners quite heavily to be quite assertive, and a lot of those partners were asking for that, and in our interviews were saying that they'd really appreciated those questions, they'd made them move forward. But those tended to be at the onboarding stage and the agreements of contracts, so they often actually hit some of the smaller partners, smaller intermediary organizations that CEDA partnered with, whereas the larger established partnerships that were already rolling along, well established, handled by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, didn't come under that same level of scrutiny. So you have this bulk of funding and this large intermediary, as you were saying, that is very often seen as the donor, that is the gatekeeper to CEDA, if CEDA is known to be the back donor at all, and not coming under the same degree of scrutiny and assertiveness at all. So there's something very strong there. I love the point you made about mini-me's and the point that quite a few of you raised around this question of the best placed actor and who is the best placed actor and who decides, and your point, Smruti, around donor darlings, that was something that we saw quite clearly as well, that often CEDA and other donors were taking, for example, their list of local partners from the ones who'd already been approved by the country-based pool funds, or there was a kind of word of mouth, so sort of a network of sort of fairly more elite organizations that got to be the favored ones. And that whilst we saw in a couple of countries, and DRC being one of them, where, say, the country-based pooled fund was looking to do a much more proactive mapping of who was out there rather than relying on the same clique. On the whole, there was this, like you say, the sort of the well-funded few who are not necessarily those who represented the spread of organizations that were best placed to achieve the reach that was required. And then finally, yeah, power. It's all about power, isn't it? And we got a very useful challenge actually as we were concluding the study around, are we challenging power enough here, or are we going, as you were saying in your typology, Anita, are we going more for sort of incremental change? Does incremental change, given that donors hold a lot of the power in these relationships, does incremental change from donors, will that drip feed into power, or do we need something more radical? And I think that very much remains to be seen, but I think by keeping that on the agenda, reminding right the way through that this is not about, well, it is partly about, yes, we can adjust audit controls, we can adjust things on overheads, but it needs to be within this sort of cultural understanding of the why, and the why is a power shift. And that links very strongly as well to the who owns risk as well as who owns money and ethics ultimately. And there's one quote that really stayed with me from one of the local national organizations in Myanmar that our colleague Chiri interviewed. And I'll just quickly read it out here from the report, which I have in front of me. And it says localization is a power relationship, but localization is also a moral responsibility. It has to be an ethical approach. Power unbalance is the biggest challenge. So if there's any words that we can leave Sweden and other donors with, I think it would be to keep that front of mind as they go about the smaller but also challenging issues of shifting the practice, making those incremental changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I think that there's strong agreement between all of you, I think, on the analysis is very much shared, I think, and my sense is that we do not need lots of further research to be able to identify where change is needed and what the real and fundamental problems are. And again, this is not the technical issues that can be easily altered. It's about some much more profound aspects of this aid system that we are talking about. So Mats, I will ask you now, I think you have received some questions and comments, and I'll ask you, maybe you could take a couple, if you take two, and please you decide who we should direct this to make it effective, please.
Thank you. I've received several comments and questions here, and I'll try to start with some which I think are directed to the team, the evaluation team. First, we have some questions and comments on what do we mean by local and natural actors. We have the presence of two really local organizations here that without questions, but we have the Mission des Femmes Intégrées pour la Contribution Humanitaire et l'Émancipation, and we have Emilio Benzieli, who is representing us, a refugee Congolese organization based in Mombasa. But we have a question from Sarah Robinson. Do CEDA's plans for localization include grassroots and community-based organizations and mutual aid groups who do not hold official registration? We don't have any from CEDA here, but maybe you and the team know enough about their policies to answer that. There is also a comment from Ines Dahl. In projects implemented in the health sector, we always work with the local health authorities to strengthen the local health system facing humanitarian crisis. But this do not appear in the localization figures because it's the support of public bodies. Local implementing partners are rare in health interventions. If I may take just another one directed at Gang, you mentioned that there are 5 local and national actors being present in your last slide. Have they received support in terms of briefings, training, and financing overheads linked to this role? And were they comfortable in speaking? Did they feel that they could participate and influence decisions there? So how are they faring? There are several more questions, but I stop there for the time so that we can have some interaction.
Thanks very much, Mats. So we'll direct them to the team. So the first one on Charlotte, would you like to address that, the issue of sort of unregistered or less formal organizations? How are they being dealt with? Sophia, would you like to talk about how we treat local authorities, part of the public sector? And then Gang, there was a question directly to you. So please, Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question, and we were really conscious when we were doing the research that we use, as was said in the discussion just now, we use this term very loosely, these sort of local organizations, and referring to a really broad spectrum of different types of organizations, from really quite large national NGOs to very small sort of grassroots organizations and often women-led organizations, as Smriti said. We were in the scope of what we did, we sort of boxed off a little bit ourselves. So we said that we didn't think that we had the reach to talk to real grassroots organizations because we didn't have the the number of people on the team, the sort of budget in order to really get down to grassroots organizations. So we were sort of conscious that them as very important actors, but we had to be honest and say that we didn't have that reach in terms of interviewing those organizations. So we were aware that the funding that Sweden provides often would trickle down to those organizations, but we weren't able to trace that. And that's an issue, I think, generally around the sort of traceability of funding, generally, that we couldn't kind of follow it down the chain. So therefore, we didn't have that sort of visibility. So I think that sort of answers that question. I'll hand over to Sophia on the issue of government or state actors.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. And I think similar on state actors, although if you look, if anybody's interested, it's actually on the beginning of the report on page 27 is where we set out. Sorry, I've just had a request to raise my voice. Hopefully you can all hear me. Yeah. So we do actually, within our definition of a local national actor, we do include national and local responders. So we take the grand bargain definition, national and local responders. So that is governments. It also includes Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies and local civil society. But that said, when we were following the money from intermediaries, given that CEDA doesn't currently fund local actors directly through its humanitarian funds, when we followed the money through intermediaries, we didn't come up to any government authorities through humanitarian funding. But it goes back a little bit to what we were discussing earlier around the need for coherence and not missing opportunities, because obviously there is a great deal of development funding, including, I would imagine, although I don't know the figures on this, for local health systems that comes from the development side of house. And we found that particularly with the civil society strengthening unit, but also the wider development side of house in CEDA, that there were often missed opportunities to make those connections and to learn. Yeah, and also looking at how changes in how the development side of house is being funded that have occurred since we wrote the report, including push towards localization there, but also the withdrawal from a number of countries that did have quite promising nexus approaches that were joining up their humanitarian and development work. It remains to be seen how much that connection with national authorities and subnational authorities can be really brought into the localization discussion writ large.
Thank you. Thank you. I think, yes, there is a bit of a void, I think, in terms of looking at them as actors here. So please, Gang.
Thanks for the question. Case is really appreciated by local and national actors because they are given direct funding, of course, after going through the long due diligence process. You know, the most important thing is not only funding, as we always say, localization is not only about funds transfer, but it's also about capacity strengthening. And there is a huge team that is and a huge program that is behind giving that money directly to local actors. Myself, I've been hired as a consultant with the Kaizen company that is accompanying those 6 actors, national actors that have benefited USA direct funding. And then we go by first step 1, where we are going to talk to actors. They are going to all their needs, and out of their needs, we are going to ask them what their priorities are. And after convening with them and say, yes, let's bring up the 3 first priorities or 5 first priorities, and then the Kaizen is going to spread over the technical consultants, the different themes. Like I was assigned the themes on project management, where I have to reinforce capacities of those national actors on logistics, on administration, on human resources, and all that. And this has been the second round where we are giving them capacity. The USAID is providing capacity strengthening, and the most important thing that has been added is those 6 partners are now being trained on networking. Networking, because USAID says it will not be capable of reaching out to all DRC national organizations. Now, those 6 partners are now teaching other national actors on how to access USAID portal, how to be registered, and how to start making proposals, project proposals online. This is really something very interesting, and you now wonder. USAID is taking, and the natural actors are saying, yes, USAID is taking a risk, because even though we've gone through all the diligence process, but it's money that has been given in our hands, and everybody's trying its best possible to remain as USAID partner. And the fact that USAID presents it, or the steps of grant and after project, and then to become a partner of USAID, everybody is just fighting hard to not disappoint USAID and to not lose this chance. This is a good example where national actors
Gang froze. Did we lose him? Yes, in the meantime, Smriti, you'd like to add something to what Gang was just saying?
Yeah, actually, I would like to challenge something. We keep talking about capacity. You know what one woman leader said to me recently? She said, you know what? What do internationals do? They buy capacity because they have resources. If I had the same kind of money, I can buy resources. I can buy quality staff that will be able to deliver exactly what INGOs are delivering longer term. So for me, it's really about, will you resource local organizations so they can keep their capacity, be more sustainable, and are really able to deliver? So I think we kind of get into this capacity trap, and somehow that's where the deficit thinking, because if I see the kinds of capacities that they have, they're so relevant for what they're doing, right? So we're not valuing that and funding that. We are then looking only upwards. The bureaucracy that's set by the aid administration to kind of, in a way, that whole thing about capacity to do compliance rather than capacity to really act. And the second thing is, in the whole kind of now arena of shrinking funds, why are we carrying on funding hugely expensive international response and surge capacity instead of investing that money in local collective capabilities to be able to deal with their own problems? We need to do that, shifting this thing about capacity, because I'm sorry, it's no longer possible. Those people are never going to graduate from the capacity school if we carry on like this. Sorry to be challenging on this.
No, the challenge is duly noted. I think many of us are nodding when you say this. Again, you're talking about the system which is not balanced, where the access and who decides on resources is not clear. We only have 6 minutes left. I'd like to add one more question, if Mats could select one, and then give the panelists and the Gang a minute each for final comments.
I have 2 questions, and I will ask them to both, because one I think is already answered, and the answer could be a simple yes. Did the team have difficulty calculating that the 17% figure, given different funding patterns and the lack of clear reporting on by some intermediaries? Yes, they had difficulties. But there's a question that I think the full panel can react to, and it comes from Marta Bruno from FEU. The question is if there were any variations in progress or good practices in localization in different humanitarian sectors, and on the key point of adapting risk management and organizations that we could look for to innovative practices.
Thank you, Mats, and thank you for that question. So what I'll do, I'll ask the four of you to include that when you give us your final comments, a minute or so. What have you seen in terms of differentiation or variation in terms of good example experiences that could be learned from and differences in practices and so on? So please, if you could comment on that and anything else you would like to say within this very short time space. So Gang, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you, Johan. Like as I said, there are so many cases, case studies that have been conducted into Congo. To come up to what Smriti.
I think we have a problem.
Armed groups,
Yeah,
is, for example, they ask really local actors in the together in a sort of consortium. What they did is they gave them capacity buildings, then they started giving them small amount of money and showing them, like evaluating them against what they are doing on the one.
there is a problem with your connection.
They are now at 200.
Yes, you're talking about the consortia coming together, local organizations coming together as a good and interesting example that we should look at and learn from. Thank you, Gang. I'll move on to VG, please.
Thanks, Johan. In terms of final reflections, I can only say that I totally agree and to some extent disagree with the capacity building statement like Smriti, and agree with many of the other things that have been said. And I think this is a discussion that we've been having for the last 20 years, and I think we'll continue to have for the next 20 before we see any real progress, because behavior change takes that long to happen. And ultimately, this is a behavior change issue. On the question about good practices, I would say that I haven't seen it as much in what we consider core humanitarian sectors, but there are a lot of good practices on the risk reduction side, particularly when you look at disaster risk reduction, because you're actually involving communities in everything from planning to looking after themselves to strengthening financial and social systems. So I think that's a good place to look for ways forward. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very good. Directing us to the disaster risk reduction area, which sort of encompasses both the developmental and the humanitarian side of things. Thank you. Smriti, please.
Yeah, so my final recommendations, two things. One is Team Sweden should include local partners, because at the moment they don't. And have some structural conversations, I don't know, once a year or once every 2 years with local partners who are already existing, right? Because of the intermediaries. So they must have this structural conversation and then set the strategy or implementation plan afterwards. And the second part is please practice the FAIR principles, inclusion, equity, that you're asking local organizations to practice in their programming, right? If you practice that as a donor, then we will come to a much better place quickly. And each country will have progress at different level because it depends on the enabling conditions in the country, but also enabling conditions that the donors and the intermediaries will create for that to take place. But really, Sweden needs to be really on the ball in terms of following up with intermediaries with a bit more decolonized lens in terms of the language that's used, the approaches that are used, and also internal reflection of the behavior and attitude also of the staff of SIDA as well, all levels, because that's where power lies. And unless you have real reflection on power, and we've done this with other donors, things will not move forward, even if you have a policy and a strategy. Thanks.
Thank you. We need real and honest introspection among donors. That's very clear. So Anita, please, you go last.
Thank you. I'll try not to say the same things that Smriti and Vijay already said, but I agree with all of them. So the first point is listen to local and national organizations as you build that strategy. I mean, that one, yes, Smriti said it. I want to say it again because it's that important. Please, as you build that strategy, consult, and listen, not just at the strategy development stage, but all the way through. So that's the first point. The second point is policy coherence between your development and your humanitarian and your peace building efforts. This is super critical. There's actually likely lots that can be learned from Sweden's efforts in the development in this civil society strengthening work that can be brought into the humanitarian sector. So build in policy coherence and listen to your colleagues and how they already are reaching local and national organizations. And the third is just a reminder of that PowerPoint that Smriti mentioned earlier, like hold that at the heart so that you can build towards transformational change within the system and not keep that the focus incremental. Over.
Thank you. Very good. We could have continued talking for a long while, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to invite further questions and comments. But I'd say that we who commissioned the evaluation and the team sort of offer this report to you, and we wish that you can make a good use of it, being guided also by the wise comments that we've had today from our three panelists. I think those who happen to be working in a country where there's a Swedish embassy might be interested in contacting the embassy. We think that the SIDA has really seriously taken on board this evaluation and is working on doing what they can to make sure that it's being implemented. And so if you want to establish contact with the SIDA colleagues, partners in any country, please do so and see if you could do something in terms of follow-up. So thank you so much, team, panelists. There are other interesting events being presented by EBA, so please go to their website. Thank you very much for attending. Have a very good day, a good evening. Thank you. Goodbye.